What's up, YouTube? Dustin from DC Media. Well, this is going to be a new series of videos. This is part one of I don't know how many parts. But what it's going to be is going to be a beginner's guide on how to select parts for a PC. Then we're going to build a PC. And then we're going to go through how to install Windows and how to do upgrades to suit some of your needs, whether it's gaming or maybe editing or whatever it might be. So with that being said, this first video is going to be going over kind of an idea, at least, how to pick the proper case, or what to consider when picking out a case, and some cooling ideas as far as cooling the CPU, because that's the two first things you got to look at when you're building a computer. Alright, so you're going to read a lot of stuff on the internet where they might say, hey, build around a CPU or build around a motherboard. Now, you can do that. There is no wrong answer here. But typically, whenever I'm dealing with someone who's a first-time builder, our first step is to look at the case itself. For a lot of reasons. The case can dictate quite a bit. It can dictate what kind of motherboard you could use, power supply, cooling options. It can dictate a lot. So with that in mind, that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. How do you go about figuring out what case you should get? Well, first thing you need to do is look at the area that you're going to be putting the PC. How much room can you allot to the case or the tower itself? And there's options. You have full tower, mid tower, there's micro style cases or mini cases, depending on whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of options out there, and each one has its pros and cons. Small form factor cases, well, they're small form factor. They don't take up a lot of room. But you typically sacrifice room for wiring, larger graphics cards. Sometimes you have to get special power supplies of special sizes. And you also lose a lot of cooling options. The bigger cases take up a ton of room, but they typically have pretty good airflow and almost unlimited cooling options. So there's a lot of variables when looking at cases. The other thing to consider is what are you going to be setting the case on? Is it going to be like my computer where it's setting back here on the desk? Or are you going to put it on carpet? So you need to make sure it has feet so it's elevated up. All that kind of plays a factor. So once you kind of figure out what physical limitations you have for a case, you can start looking at cases online. Now, most of us are probably going to wind up settling on a mid-tower case. That's what I have behind me. There's two builds on my channel currently. One I gave away in this build. Both are considered mid-tower cases. So once you figure out that you're going to be using a mid-tower case, there's a couple other things you need to look at. First thing is going to be, do you need an optical drive? Now, that is being phased out, but a lot of people still want the ability to utilize it to, rip music off, CDs or, whatever you're doing. But some people still want the idea to have that optical drive. And the other thing to consider is what kind of hard drives are you wanting to use? SSDs, HDDs, how many of each? Because some cases are more user-friendly than other cases as far as, being able to put more or less of either one in. So you might have to want more 2.5s, you might give up HDDs. If you want a cleaner look at all, you might have to give up several of each. So it could change how many of each you wind up purchasing, or it could change the physical size. Instead of getting, say, to 500 gigs, you might get a single terabyte, or whatever the scenario might play out. But that's something to consider as well. Now, those are all pretty simplistic. But once you start looking at cases, you're going to start looking at the motherboard. Will it, full ATX, micro, mini, whatever it might be. That way you can start looking at motherboard options after you figure out what case you want. Because the case is definitely going to dictate what motherboard you're going to get. Now, if you're going with the mid tower, you're probably going to have, full ATX is probably going to fit just fine. So you're pretty much unlimited. But make sure you read the case's description to make sure it fits with what other motherboard that you wind up looking at. Or make sure you look for motherboards that fit in the case. Now, the next thing is cooling. Now, whether you go air-cooled or water-cooled, there's pros and cons to both. And there's also pros and cons to the idea if you want a silent build. Excuse me. A silent build winds up, could be water cooling, whether it's all-in-one cooler for your CPU or GPUs, or maybe you're doing a custom loop, which I kind of doubt if you're watching this video. It's probably not your first thing you want to tackle. So you might wind up with a similar system like mine, where I'm running air-cooled GPUs right now and an all-in-one cooler on my CPU. But then you have to worry about other things if you're going that route. You have to worry about, what size radiator does the all-in-one cooler have? 120, 240, whatever it might be. And then you have to worry about the radiator's thickness and the fans. And you have to understand that most manufacturers will have those specs listed there. And a lot of case manufacturers are getting to the point where they'll tell you what it supports. Whether it'll support a radiator in the top or the front or whatever it might be. A lot of new case manufacturers or new cases will have those things depicted. And when you're looking at that, you have to consider the thermal capabilities of the case itself. Now, we don't do that testing just yet. Too small of a channel, too much time involved, and honestly, I just don't have, enough cases or anyone sending me cases like a massive channel does. So I would refer you to GamersNexus. I'll link that in the description below. He does a very thorough review over what the cases can do. He'll go over, how silent or loud in some cases the cases are, how well they have airflow management, things like that. And that will help you depict on what's the best case for you. So if you're looking at that, I would definitely check out his channel, especially if he has a case that you're looking at already reviewed on his channel. He goes extremely, extremely in depth, and he's very thorough. So you can, I trust him. I trust what they say. It's a very reputable source. But with that being said, the only other concern is, with water, if you're doing an all-in-one cooler, typically the radiator fan combinations can be a little bit cumbersome, and then you have the issue of making sure that you have enough room for that so you don't have clearance issues with GPUs, things of that nature. But you can typically get a cooler system and more silent. So you can run a silent mode like I run back there. I run silent mode all the time on my Kraken, and the only fans I ever hear are my GPU fans whenever I'm doing something very graphic intensive. So that's a plus. But they do cost a little bit more than an air-cooled option. On an air-cooled side, in order to get enough cooling, typically they're a larger cooler. So if you're getting a behemoth-style air cooler, you got to make sure it fits in the case. Now, most coolers will come with dimensions, or they'll have dimensions listed somewhere for specs on their respective websites, and you can reference that back to the case to make sure there's clearance between the door and the case itself. And that's about the only other thing. Air-cooled typically runs a little bit louder, but if that's not a problem for you, then it's not a big deal. Now, other than that, the only other things you have to consider are, do you want a window, or is it going to be on display, kind of like ours is? Do you want a silent system? Are you going to put LEDs in it at some point? Are you going to have, other options moving forward? So there's a lot of things to consider, but the prime ones basically are, make sure it fits within the space that you have. Make sure that it's going to be acceptable to use that case for whatever cooling method you're going to use for your CPU and or GPUs if you're using something for your GPU. The next step would be to make sure it's aesthetically pleasing to you. Obviously, what I like, what you like might not be the same, so you need to make sure you like what you're purchasing. Should go without saying. And the other thing is just to make sure it fits in your budget. If you're piecing your PC together, then you might have to get a couple different budgets or a couple different options for a PC if you're trying to figure out what you're going to be doing. So that way, if you're, hey, if I buy this graphics card, I get this case. If I buy this graphics card or this CPU, I can get that case, whatever. So that way you can push and move around money a little bit to make sure you're getting what you want. But other than that, that is pretty much it. Now in the next video, we're going to go a little bit more in detail on the cooler. We're going to go into detail about motherboard and touch on CPUs a little bit. So these videos will overlap. We're going to get a little bit more in depth and in detail. But just remember, there's just some simple basics: case size, cooling options, aesthetics, and pricing. That's the 4 main things you need to look at whenever you're looking at your case. And at the end of the day, as long as you're happy with it, whatever everybody else says, honestly, really doesn't matter. But with that being said, guys, thanks for watching this video. Look out for the next video, which is going to be, like I said, the motherboard, CPU, things of that nature, and we're going to move forward down the line. So thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.